Thank you. Thank you so much, Nathan, for that generous welcome and for also setting the stage for our discussions for the next 3 days. Additionally, to kick us off, we have Professor Noemie Bouhana. And I think that Professor Noemie Bouhana's keynote is going to complement quite nicely and significantly what Nathan has previewed for us. Secretary Smythe has talked about the challenges around content, particularly in the online spaces. That's a critical issue. And I think Professor Bouhana is going to talk to us about how that then fits in with many other factors. And so to do that, she'll be giving us a keynote address on fragmented social ecologies, understanding the emergence of fluid extremism. And it's my pleasure to introduce her before she comes to the stage. Professor Bouhana is Professor of Crime Science and Counter-Extremism at University of College London, where she co-leads the Counterterrorism Research Group. Her work is concerned with the processes involved in the emergence of extremist social ecologies in complex social systems and the mechanisms which underpin an individual's vulnerability to extremism. She's directed many research projects in the multi-millions and has worked across international consortiums in Europe and elsewhere, and the United States. Her work has also been recently funded by the Center for Research and Evidence on Security Threats, CREST, out of the UK, to develop an environmental extremism risk analysis framework for use by PREVENT practitioners. And her work has also been supported by numerous intelligence and national security agencies. And like I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think we're in for a really thought-provoking keynote address today. So Professor Bouhana, welcome, please. Over to you. So what should I have? There we go.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Sorry, it's going to take a minute to warm up because it's good evening for me, and I'm still not over that. The brief I got from Lydia for this keynote was, can you talk about whatever's shifting, whatever's changing? The thing with talking about what's new and emerging when you're in the middle of it is that you're guaranteed to be wrong. So I'm looking forward to the next 3 days, you catching me in the hallways to tell me how very wrong I am. That's completely fine. Feel free. So I am hoping, otherwise it's going to be a flop from the start, that you're all familiar with the idea of the canary in the coal mine, right? That rings a bell? Okay. It's not like just a UK thing. No. Okay, good. So the idea, obviously, of the canary in the coal mine is that, so they used to use canaries to help miners spot outbreaks of toxic gas in the mines because the canaries were small and more susceptible to the gas, and they would be the first ones to drop. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I feel, after having worked in this area for quite a while, that we still spend a lot of time in CV and CT trying to understand the canary. Right. So we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what are the causes and indicators of susceptibility to radicalization, engagement in violent extremism and terrorism. We try to design risk assessment tools so that we can, spot the canaries before they become problematic and offer them some support. And so we spend a lot of time obsessing about, what this canary is like. Me, I don't care about the canary. I only care about the mine. So what I study is basically the mine. I study, what are its features? Why is there even toxic gas in there? Why is it sometimes that we know the mine's toxic and yet it stays there for years and years and years and nothing happens, right? So I study, why did this particular canary end up in this particular mine? So that's basically as simple as I can make, given the time that I have, to give you a background on where I'm coming from. I study the mine. The thing is also, I think that we know quite a lot about the canary by now. We have, in the last 20 years, made incredible progress when it comes to especially what you might call quantitative research, statistical research, to understand what are the indicators of, if you like, canariness, right? Compared to where we were, back around 9/11, we've made quite a lot of progress, and to the point that I would say we have now about as many indicators as there are terrorists, which has its downsides, right? But the good news is that when you start to do what we call meta-analysis, like you take all the studies and all the indicators together and you try to synthesize them, you find out that there's stuff that comes across again and again, and that seems to be the essence of what being susceptible is about. And it's things like, having lower self-control than other people, being more inflexible cognitively. I'm sure this is all stuff that you know and that you will recognize. Possibly having some, impulsivity issues, having a harder time committing to social and moral rules, often having already a criminal history or some history of deviance or delinquency or something like this, or having had some problems with social problems just short of crime. This I call general susceptibility, because when you're siloed in your problem domain, you feel this is specific to your problem, but actually this is the same profile for all the social problems that we know, right? All across, when we're looking at, quote unquote normal crime, when we're looking at even issues with public health, success in school, success later in life, all that stuff, all the ones who run into trouble have this profile. I'm also not saying it's an on-off switch, like there are people like this and there are the other people. Obviously, it's a continuum of you are, on the continuum of canariness, you're at one extreme or the other one. But the canaries tend to be the one who run into most trouble and the ones that we are concerned about. So I think we already know quite a lot about them. So my approach is to just assume that they exist. They're there, right? So which is why I study the mind instead. And this is, I will admit, something of an approach that is more inspired by public health. So it's very similar to research and interventions into obesity. We're more and more understanding the canariness of obesity in the sense that we're understanding the underlying genetic causes, and there are people who just have these underlying genetic causes, and that's just the way it is. We can't change that, but it makes a great deal of difference to them which environment they live in, right? If they live in a neighborhood where every other restaurant is a KFC, it's not the same as living, on an organic farm, right? So some of them may have that genetic potential, but they live in an environment where it never gets expressed. So I'm trying to understand, how do we stop the canary even getting in the mind? Just assuming that there will be canaries. Just how do you stop getting them in there, and how do you stop the mind appearing in the first place? So from my perspective, place to explain extremism, why people turn to extremism, why extremism even exists, why it happens, especially since that's the topic of today, why it's changing forms. Place matters more than people and psychology. This is the thing you can tell me I'm wrong about later on, okay? But this is my premise. Obviously, susceptibility matters, but it matters to the extent that it interacts with exposure. And here I'm going back to the idea that, yes, there are canaries, but there are also people who are not canaries who still get involved in violent extremism, right? And to my way of thinking, this is a sort of inverse relationship. So on some work that I did, actually, that was during COVID, I found myself with lots of free time, like lots of people. And so for the Home Office, I did this piece of work where we were looking at, what kinds of indicators of risk were more easily observable in cases of people who'd been convicted of terrorist offenses, comparing the sort of individual indicators to the place and environmental indicators. And by accident, sort of found that the cases almost 50-50, actually, it was more like 55-45, fell into two groups. One set of groups that was really characterized by those susceptibility things that you expect, like, issues with mental health, problems, life accidents, grievances, and all that stuff that you associate with, people type indicators. And the second group seemed to not have those traditional susceptibility indicators, but had lots of indicators of exposure. Things like being connected to particular social networks, things like having spent a lot of time in certain places, and so on and so forth. And so it seemed to be that you had two types of groups, some that were driven by individual risk and some that were driven by environmental risk. And I thought that was pretty interesting because one, I hadn't really managed to show that before, and I just found it by accident because that's not what I was looking for on that project. But two, because I imagine if you're intervening with these individuals, you would not intervene in the same way in the cases that are driven by susceptibility factors and the cases that are driven by environmental factors. You probably wouldn't offer them the same sort of interventions and support. And this also suggested to me, as I said, canary, it's on a continuum of very much a canary to very not at all. But this suggested that you could be on the very not at all end of the continuum. But if you spent enough time in the mind, eventually you're gonna drop, right? So it's an inverse relationship. So the very, very susceptible, those are the cases you hear about where, they all by themselves spontaneously radicalize in 24 hours in their basement. They're that susceptible, right? And the other ones would be more like the cases, either they grew up in it or as adults ended up spending a lot of time in a radicalizing environment. So because, so I'm often, asked about risk assessment, and because the resources are limited, and the question is always, who do we prioritize in this gigantic list of canaries that we've got to look after? And to me, the start of trying to answer this question is to think in terms of differentiating between susceptibility and vulnerability. I am aware that most people use those words as if they were somewhat interchangeable. As an ecologist, those are separate things, right? So part of the questions that I ask myself is, within the pool of the susceptible people, and even the rest, because as I said, you can, not be a canary and still get in trouble, right? Who is vulnerable? And then, because we often need to narrow down that group even more so that we can focus our resources on it, within the vulnerable, which ones are at risk? So being a professor, I will apologize for the fact that I will use yet another analogy to sort of walk yourself through this logic. And through this analogy, I'm going to try to explain social and self-selection to you. The point being trying to show that a lot of what we think of as risk can only be understood if we know something about the places in which the problem emerges. So the radicalizing influence is found, if you like. So as I said yesterday in another setting, I've had this slide for quite a while pre-COVID, right? So there's a virus in my slide. It's not COVID for me. It's always been Ebola. But you can think about COVID if you want, if it helps. But here the idea is, okay, all right, think about Ebola. As for the sake of my argument, imagine everybody in this room is equally susceptible to Ebola. We come into contact with it, we all get the same symptoms and die at the same rate. And the same thing happens to all of us. Yeah, it's a bit morbid for first day of, anyway, hang in there. So the idea is, okay, so we're all equally susceptible to Ebola, and it's mostly a biological thing. We can't really help it. Like, it's biology. If we come into contact with it, something terrible is going to happen. But then we want to know, out of everybody in this room, of all the equally susceptible, which ones are actually vulnerable. And to work out who's vulnerable, we need to know something about where. So where is, for me, the most important word in any explanation is, where is Ebola? Where is it found right this moment in the world? I don't know really, because I'm not an epidemiologist, but let's imagine, it's some country, some forest in some country in Africa. All right. And for the sake of argument, at this moment in time, it's the only place where you can actually catch the thing. if we want to think about who's vulnerable, well, we have to start to think, okay, out of all of us here, who in their background has something, some factor, some characteristics that link them potentially to that place. It could be a professional characteristic. Maybe your company has some, business over there, and so there might be a reason for you to find yourself there. You may have family there, and so through your peer networks, you might find yourself having to go there. You may have a particular hobby having to do with, I don't know, studying a particular plant or a particular animal that you can only find there, and so there's a possibility that you would find yourself in that place. And so vulnerability is those factors. So social selection means you have a chance of finding yourself in that place because of a group you belong to. So like family is a kind of social group, right? And self-selection is you have a chance to find yourself in that place based on your preferences, the things you like and dislike. So the example of the animal and the plant that you like, okay? And those two mechanisms are not, as pretty much 100% of everything I'm going to say today is not extremism specific, right? This is true of life in general. Those are the two mechanisms that explain why you and I find ourselves in most places. Our societies are organized in such a way that certain groups, it's not deterministic, obviously, it's probabilistic, but certain groups based on their characteristics are more likely to find themselves in some places than other groups, like the rich people go to some schools and the poor people go to other schools and so on. And we say it's not like that, but actually it is like that, right? So on the basis of those mechanisms, you can work back from knowing where the problem is to who's most likely or could potentially be exposed. And remember, we're trying to risk assess. So this is intelligence that's very useful. And then once you're at the point where you're trying to, out of this pool that we've narrowed of the people in this room, some of them have ties to this place where Ebola is found. Which ones are at risk? It's when that potential tie is activated. The family actually calls and says, there's a wedding, come. The boss sends you an email and says, I got a task for you, go there, and so on and so forth, okay? So that's why it's important to differentiate between susceptibility, vulnerability, and risk. If you want to have any chance of narrowing down your pool of people you have to be worried about, right? But mostly what I mean to illustrate is that you can't do any of that if you don't know anything about place. You need to have intelligence, and the more precise, the better, about where the problem is. And that's where things like mapping comes in, which spend a lot of time clustering and mapping places is what I do. It's the same approach as any sort of crime prevention approach where you do hotspot analysis to know where to send your police patrol cars to prevent burglaries. It's exactly the same logic. And eventually, when you have enough data, you can start to predict where the hotspots are going to appear. But it's something we don't really do with violent extremism or terrorism, sometimes because we don't have the data, but also because we're very focused on the canary and not as much on place. So when I talk about place, I talk about something called radicalizing settings. To give you an idea of what settings mean, a setting is anything you can perceive through your senses at any given time. So right now, for most of us, the setting is this room, the people that are in it, and anything that's on the screen, and anything that happens to be on the phones you're not supposed to be looking at, right? That's part of the setting as well. Your brain does not differentiate what's online, what's offline. It's all going through your senses in the same way at the same time, okay? And what's interesting to know about settings is that they have specific characteristics, those extremist supportive settings, those radicalizing settings. And I call them chasm characteristics, just as to help me remember what they are. And again, stressing that that extremism is just not that special. This is the characteristics of any kind of socializing environment, like, you know, a classroom, in a school, the family dinner table. They all have those kinds of characteristics. And successful extremist settings bring those four things together to socialize people into extremist ideas. So one of those characteristics is that they foster certain kinds of cognitions. So anything that induces you to think that the rules that you've been following so far the values that you've been following so far have actually either gotten you into trouble or haven't delivered the sort of advantages you were looking for, opens up your mind to starting to think, well, maybe I should be shopping for, something new. Anything that is a sort the term cognitive opening has been, used in the past to talk about this sort of stuff. It doesn't have to be negative. So often, it's associated with like inducing stress, inducing doubt, inducing the perception that you're failing at self-control, things like this. But there's such a thing called cognitive ease, which makes you feel like actually things are, your brain's working well, you're getting everything, you're feeling fine. That can be induced as well in an extremist setting, obviously, to make you more receptive. The second thing after cognition is attachment. And you can think of attachment very easily because we are all attached to some people. But by attachment, I don't mean like, a superficial kind of attachment. I mean, a replication of the sort of link you have with your parents, for example, or your children, or people who are very close to you, okay? And we know that attachment is the basis of all our socialization. And you often find in extremist settings that when you have active radicalizing agents, they try to replicate this. So when I've done research in prisons, for example, if they spot someone they think, is a good candidate, they will parent them in the prison. They will explain to them how things work. They might invite them. In England, you have, I don't know about here, sorry, but you have, you access to private kitchens if you want in some of the prisons, so you can invite people to dinner. You can do things like this. So they parent them, and so eventually, if this goes on long enough, you can imagine how someone in an inhospitable environment might become attached to their caretakers. The other characteristics is social control, and either in the sense of pro-social, so our side, the blue team, pro-social, social control has fallen apart, is not working. Either the formal social control, as in, police, prison guards in my example, and so on. So the people who are really charged by public authority to keep things in shape. But more importantly, the informal social control, like the normal civilians, if you like, who are also in the setting, do not enforce upon each other the sort of what we would call, the normal pro-social norms of our society. Okay, that has fallen apart for XY reason. It's not working. Okay, while it's working on the other side, so the other guys, the red team can impose its social control over the setting. And finally, of course, what makes it not just a generic socialization setting, but a radicalizing or extremist setting is the types of moral norms that are being transmitted through the setting, and that may be transmitted through the radicalizing agent to which you have attached, but that can also be transmitted through material. So that's why I gave the example of maybe you have a phone in front of you in this room. If there's extremist material on it, that is transmitting moral norms to you. Those four things together are needed to create a radicalizing setting. But it's important to remember that I said this is the same for any socializing setting. So when we are trying to either de-radicalize or re-socialize, or rehabilitation's been mentioned before, anyone, we need to put them in a setting like this. We need to do the same. We can't just give the moral norms and then go away. We can't just do the attachment. I call that cupcake theory because in Iraq, they used to give cupcakes to prisoners to, get them started with the attachment thing. I call it cupcake theory. You can't just do the cognitive opening. You can't just, obviously the social control. If you're, an authority trying to rehabilitate someone, probably you already have that on your side, but you need to get all four working at the same time. And you need to do it over a period of time, right? So ideas, we often think that ideas, beliefs, things that they float, they're like immaterial, but no, they are anchored in a place and a time, always, okay, by us in settings like this. And you can only transmit them through that, okay? They don't just float. I mean, if you throw them out into the virtual world and you do nothing else, they're just gonna pass by and it's not gonna change anything for anybody. obviously, when we think about radicalizing settings, I don't hear this term used so much anymore, but the idea of hotbeds. So back in the UK, I don't know about here, but for a long time we had strategy documents that mentioned, we have to prevent hotbeds, or we have to detect the hotbeds, and they were either in universities. In fact, at UCL, we had some cases of active violent extremism, and we're not proud, but it was there. And also prisons are obviously a big thing, and still are. I hear less about universities, but still quite a lot of concerns about prisons being radicalizing settings around questions. So I'm a member of the independent advisory group for the prison service, and the question is always, do we disperse? Do we concentrate? What do we do? So I had the opportunity, that was quite a while back, to do research in category of prisons in the UK. And mostly a lot of very interesting things I discovered again by accident, because I'm not a prison researcher, but I was at the time mentoring Met police officers who were doing a master's degree, and then negotiated access to the prison. But it took so long, even for Met police officers with the right connections, that by the time they got the access, they had finished their degree. So I had the access left over, and I thought, like, this can't go to waste, and the prison service didn't want this to go to waste. I mean, negotiating access took like 2.5 years, so you can imagine, and that's with police officers on our side. So I went in, but what I did with this particular project was not talk to the offenders. So I didn't talk to any tact offenders. That wasn't the point. My police officer students had talked to some of them, but not many, because most of them declined to take part in the study, unsurprisingly. But I talked to people who worked in the prison. So I talked to prison guards, and I talked to psychologists and the people running the intelligence units, and the chaplains and imams, and anyway. And mostly because I wanted to use them as, we call this ecological observers. I was using them as CCTV cameras, CCTV cameras with opinions. Right? And asking them, what do you see in the prison? And at the time, the big concern of the prison service was that they had a radicalization epidemic on their hands. That's not what I saw. Obviously, it's a qualitative study. I was there, all by myself for a short period of time, so who knows? But mostly what I heard was a lot of what I call behavioral conversion. So, making it look like you're part of, wearing the outward signs, but no real signs of a commitment to an ideology or anything like this, mostly because there are incentives inside to, look part of that. But what was particularly interesting also from a place perspective is that you didn't have, even in the prisons, and there were some that had cases that you would call, concerning in terms of radicalization, violent extremism. It wasn't the whole prison. It was often like, a cell block, or, a workshop, or a particular group that met, for, whatever social purposes. And so what it tells you is that when you think about prison radicalization, or solving the problem of radicalization in a prison, it sounds, where do you start? What end of the problem do you, what kind of even information do you need to get to grips to this? But if I tell you, well, it's this cell block, and then suddenly you have a unit of analysis, and you can narrow it down, and who is in there, what are they doing in there, is it all the time, is the problem only in the evenings, what kind of activities, and so on. Suddenly you feel like, I can have it in my hands, this problem. I can seize it. I can do something with it. Okay. And for me, a great benefit of rooting problems in place and in space, and space-time, it kind of goes together, is that it helps you take those things that float around and seem completely ungraspable, and suddenly make them a lot more concrete. If you're at all familiar with, other areas of crime prevention, like situational crime prevention and so on, this is almost, very much the same logic. Instead, in this case, you're not really trying to prevent people from engaging in particular behaviors, but prevent them from acquiring a particular mindset. What was also interesting, so the reason why I wanted to talk about setting as well is that, as it said earlier on a slide, I don't know if you noticed it in passing, but it says places choose people. Because we think of often, why did they go there? What was their reason for finding themselves there? I have explained, because of social and self-selection, sometimes you go somewhere and in a way it has nothing to do with you. This is how the world is organized, and that's why you find your place, you find yourself there, right? Because of the nature of a place, it tends to attract certain groups, and groups tends to have certain characteristics. And that means that a place often attracts people who have similar profiles, for lack of a better word, similar sort of background characteristics or indicators, okay? Obviously, most people who go at school, they're either teachers or they're school children. Schools tend to attract, and other types of people you won't find very much. That doesn't mean it never happens, but it means by and large, someone in a school, it's either going to be a teacher, an administrator, or a school student, okay? In the prisons, obviously, everybody's got a criminal background, so that's not distinctive at all. But what I found interesting is that so this particular case that's up there was reported to me as someone. So when you look at this person, violent, mentally disordered, impulsive, antisocial, sexually deviant, a repeat offender, which is why he's in the category of prison. You think this is a canary, right? You think this is on the susceptibility scale. This is, and yes, certainly this person is, but remember, susceptible and vulnerable, not the same thing. And so while this person is susceptible, and possibly they would have been vulnerable to being recruited by one group or another outside the prison, inside the prison, because of the conditions of the time, this profile, instead of being a risk profile, was a protective profile. Because the types of tact offenders at that time in that prison were people with no criminal experience, like they were first-timers. The tact offense was the reason why they found themselves. However, it gave them some charisma, some aura, some status inside the prison, so they could afford to have other people, not tact offenders, sort of bodyguard for them, keep them safe. Because they're like you and me, people who have never been in prison. They're scared of being in prison, they're scared of other prisoners, and especially the ones who look crazy like that, right? And so the point was, they weren't ever going to radicalize this guy because they didn't want to spend 5 minutes with this guy. In fact, they were telling their bodyguards to not let this guy get anywhere near me, okay? So that profile in that prison at that time is a protective profile. While in another prison or at another time or outside or, it would have been a risk profile. So the point of place is to understand that the profiles are unstable by nature, because a profile is only a risk or a protective profile attached to a context. And so you can never, ever have a stable risk profile. The only thing that is really stable is the susceptibility characteristics that I talked about in the beginning definition of canary nest. But that is why, sometimes we collect those indicators and why they accumulate. Because each time there's a new selective profile, there's new indicators, age changes, gender changes, the type of grievances changes, the geographical location, the occupation, the social strata, all of that changes over time because the places of radicalization, they move around, okay? And that's why, Al-Qaeda didn't do its recruiting in the same place that ISIS did, and they had very different people as working for them. So keeping going with your waves, if the time, yeah, thank you. Because you know me, I can talk about this for like a couple of hours. So keeping going with the idea of place, and I mentioned at the start, the mind, I want to know what the mind is like. So that's understanding the setting, right? I want to know how the canary ended up in the mind. That's understanding social selection and self-selection, right? But I also want to understand why the mind is where it is, and maybe why in that particular environment there's lots of them, while in some other environment, some other neighborhood next door, there aren't any. And so for that you need to study ecologies. and you try to look for characteristics of those environments that surround those places that have shown to be radicalizing settings, right? And mostly, I'm going to give you like the end of the story at the beginning. It's that you find that those environments have characteristics associated with something we call social disorganization. And if you have any criminological background or crime prevention background, you'll recognize this, because same as with the canary nest, same as with pretty much everything I've spoken so far, it's not extremism specific, right? It's just a sign of an unhealthy social environment in general. So in those places, you have problem concentration. Yes, you have radicalization and extremists and people in the street spouting strange ideas, right, or dangerous ideas, but you also have, you know, mental health disorders and public health disorders, possibly some crime and some other things. Those are not healthy places, right? And they're socially disorganized in the sense that the stuff that I was talking about, like, you know, social control, neighbors doing things for each other, neighbors trusting the police, trusting local authorities, and this stuff is not working there, okay? So we did, in sort of a first approach that was funded by the US Department of Defense, actually, by the Air Force of all people, a large 3-year social ecological project, part of which was a survey in London where we compared a prevent priority area borough that we matched on meaningful characteristics to another borough that was not a prevent priority area. And we did a large scale postal survey. Interestingly, you know, people told us, you're sending them by post. Who is going to respond to you? Yes, we had to send like 20,000 to get back, like, I can't remember how it was, but less than 1,000. But it doesn't matter, because when you do a social ecological survey, it's not the response rate that matters, it's the distribution of response, because this is a survey where you use people as CCTV cameras. And so all you want is to have an observer in every place in the borough, right? Who can tell you, this is what I see in the street. When I look out the window, this is what I see. And mostly, because I don't have time at all to go into details, what we find is that the places that have the radicalizing settings, so in this case, you know, cases of radicalization that led to a conviction in the UK, you find that they're more socially disorganized than the other ones. In this particular case, it was notably characterized by the fact that the populations were a lot more transient. So people don't stay in those neighborhoods. They don't stay for long. They move along, and as you can imagine, that sort of disrupts everything else. Being linked to a single person household. I'm understanding from my colleagues in public health that this is more and more an indicator of problems. And I say that as someone who lives alone, right? So I'm probably causing problems in some way. But as you can imagine, single person households, for, you know, even in wealthy places, they don't have the same ties to communities that you have if you have kids. And that makes perfect sense in a way, right? So those communities aren't as tightly bonded together as they would otherwise be. And if we end up with communities and neighborhoods where it's mostly single people, the ecology is going to be totally different from even, you know, the kinds of communities we were used to 20, 30 years ago. So there are determinants, ecological determinants offline of where you find the radicalizing settings. They are the same online. So I get to my topic of fluid extremism. To borrow Rappaport way of thinking of it, mostly the academics in the room are going to get it. I don't know if the other ones are, but basically it's the idea that, you know, there are waves of terrorism. Like there was, you know, the anarchist wave, and then the left wing, and the anti-colonialist, and blah, blah, blah. Not everybody agrees with this sort of, you know, but for my purposes, I'm not going to do much with it. So the wave that's just ending is the religious wave, for obvious reasons. And it didn't start with even like the Islamists, and, you know, there were also like Shinrikyo and, you know, Christian militias in the US. And so, you know, most of us here, like when I lecture to my students, they don't get that part because they weren't alive in the run-up to the new millennium, right? But most of you were, I'm assuming. And so, you know, in that run-up, you had sort of like a lot of apocalyptical thinking going on. And so that sort of gave a flavor to this new wave, plus 9/11 after. But so there's some question of, you know, is the new wave mixed, unclear, and stable, right? Is that going to be the new wave? It's been called all sorts of things. I'm sure you know, are familiar with those terms, like, you know, salad bar is the one that comes a lot. Mixed, unclear, unstable, I've already mentioned. I've heard composite, extremism, fringe fluidity, all sorts of, you know, self-service, DIY terrorism, you know, make your own adventure terrorism, and so on and so forth. You know, spend all day coming up with new names for this. And so the question is, you know, is this like a blip, or are we looking at, you know, the future of extremism so the idea of the waves of Rappaport's wave is like, it's a generation. So we're in it for 40 years before there's another shift, if he's correct. So Lydia said, talk about what's shifting and what's new. I have no idea whether fluid terrorism is a thing. I think when you're in the middle, especially at the start of the change, you can't tell. Someone calls the fifth wave of terrorism, like every week, every other week, there's a new fifth wave of terrorism. So right now, this is it. But, you know, before that, it was right-wing stuff. Before that, it was, you know, ethnic-based groups. So each wave supposedly has, let me remember, a specific manifesto, a setting event, and its own sort of tactic. So as you can imagine, the religious wave, it was like suicide terrorism. So for this wave, I don't know what the setting event could be. The attack on the Capitol, maybe the new weapon. It's like, I don't know, the deep fake, the hashtag. I don't know. The manifesto, I really have no idea. So I don't know is the point. You probably have your own opinion, and I'd love to hear what it is in the next 3 days. But going back to my obsession with place, and since the only thing I really care about is where and not why, is that the state of our ecology. So ecology, I've been using this word, haven't really defined it. We're so used to hearing it a lot in relation to climate change. Ecology are the relationship between people and their relationship to their physical environment. That's an ecology, all right? So when I talk about ecology, I'm talking about the people and the places together. And our ecology is changing a lot. And what I feel is that, I don't know if there's such thing as fluid, mixed, unclear extremism. I don't think we have enough cases yet. We have anecdotes. We have, you know, some indicators. We have a few years of, you know, referrals that we can look at and so on. That's not enough to, you know, call it. But I would say that the conditions suggest that there should be, is from an ecological perspective, because we are experiencing what I call ecological fragmentation. And again, I realize I keep repeating the same thing, but it's not extremism specific, right? It's not there just to cause extremism. It's happening everywhere. In fact, it's happening to animals as well. It's called habitat fragmentation, right? And it's happening to us as well. So let's think that we used to live through, you know, bigger, more uniform habitats, yeah? And now they're breaking down into smaller and smaller and smaller bits. So for animals, it has, as you can imagine, all sorts of bad things, you know, bad effects like loss of biodiversity. It screws completely with the prey relationship towards, you know, the victim, target, whatever. It creates all sorts of problems for them. It happens a lot when we build a new road or a new something. We create habitat fragmentation for the animals. We're creating habitat fragmentations for ourselves now a lot. Some of my colleagues call this on-life habitats or on-life radicalization in this particular case, because they say rightly that the online-offline dichotomy makes zero sense. As I explained with the setting, your brain doesn't really make the difference between what's online, what's offline. All the time, you will have people that you know, people in this room who will say to you, have you seen this thing on Facebook? Right. and then you'll be on X, and it will send you to a thing in the real world. I don't like to use real world, but you see what I mean. So they talk about on-life habitats. I like to talk about augmented habitats. So we have still our physical habitats augmented by some others. And this sort of mishmash, and because of the change that's been introduced by the online habitats, created fragmentation. I will give some illustrations. But we did some work as part of the same social ecological project in Aarhus in Denmark, where we did in-depth focus groups and interviews with kids who were in the same networks of other people who had gone to Syria from there. All right. Obviously, we didn't talk to the people who went to Syria because either when they got back, they were arrested or they died there. But we were able to talk to people in their community, especially the young people. And I wanted to ask a question that hadn't seen answered, or at least not really looked into that much before. There's lots of research and on what are people looking at on the internet, even on, how long do they look at it and so on and so forth. There's not much done asking, what were you doing when you were looking at the stuff on the internet? So what were the circumstances in which you were looking at this? And remember, because I'm a place girl, right? And I care about my chasm settings, right? And so to me, I'm always baffled by the idea that you look at a thing and it has an effect. It doesn't work like that. And indeed, when we talk to our young people, they would say things like, so the example that I remember always the best is when they said, after school, we'll always go to this restaurant, this diner, American style diner in Denmark. And we, have fries or whatever, and we all sit around the same table, several of us together, and we do this, most days of the week. And, they will have conversation about things that young people talk about. And at some point, someone might say, oh, have you seen this thing on, fill in your platform of choice, TikTok, whatever, and put the phone in the middle of the table, and they will look at it as a group, right? And then they'll have some kind of discussion about what they saw. And it's not necessarily, oh yeah, that's it. I completely buy into this new extremist narrative. No, it's not like that. But over time, repeated, sometimes they think it's dumb and stupid, but sometimes, it catches their attention and they start talking about it. And that's a chasm sitting, right? The stuff on the phone all by itself, it is nothing. But the phone in the group, in the diner, it has the cognition, it has the attachment, it has the social control, because no one in the diner cares about or asks what the kids are up to. They're away from their parents' supervision. That's why they go to the diner after school every day, to get away from supervision. And it has the extremist moral norms elements coming through the phone and possibly from, each other. So the fragmentation of the habitats, like I said, I think suggests that if the fifth wave is mixed, unclear, unstable, I'm not going to be surprised. Okay. So the fragmentation of the habitat, it used to be that, to create new settings, we had hard physical limits. Create a new place, attract new people, set up some new activity in it. The limit was distance, it was space, it was cost, and so on, time. Online, you create a new setting like that, right? The new settings, you can create a new community in the responses to somebody's blog post, right? And the responses take a life of their own. Like I said yesterday, I'm still a geek, but I used to go to, sci-fi conventions and things like this when I was younger. And it was the same process, and you would have, those discussions and you get embroiled and, it could span months and years, right? So this online happens all the time, multiplied by, I have no idea. And those are all settings, right? And those settings are desegregated. So I've heard about, mention of echo chambers and stuff like this. What concerns me is not the stuff that goes on in encrypted, it concerns me in the sense that the stuff that goes on in the encrypted channels is about action, is about, getting the weapons and doing the stuff. But I'm talking here about radicalization, so changing the mindsets. And that happens more and more openly in settings where there's no barrier to entry, right? Everybody knows how to get there. They're all outlinked, so you can get from one setting to another, often not looking for it, right? You just follow the links on and on and on. The settings self-reproduce because, you know, people carry the conversation from one platform to another, to another, to another, and seed it. And so you have fluid, chasm, extremist settings all over the place, springing up all the time. Because they're not segregated, I think we're going to go, if this keeps happening, from intersectional vulnerability. So vulnerability where, you know, it accumulates, you know, being a guy, being of that age, being of that ethnicity, living in that place. It accumulates within a person, the vulnerability. To transsectional, it's going to be across groups. Because it used to be, you might imagine, you know, only the people on the fringe were exposed. And now it's going to be also the middle stratas. So yesterday I used the example of the yoga moms. And are there yoga moms in the room? Because, you know, I got some flack for that. So I won't do it again. But that means that the selection markers, the risk markers might change, and we might end up having, you know, people we really didn't expect to show up in those. And you will have mainstreaming because you'll have social diffusion across social groups. The other thing that you'll have in those settings is that people will, the nature. So I gave the example of the wellness entrepreneur or wellness influencer yesterday, who, especially since COVID, you know, you have one post on Instagram that's about protein shakes, and then the next one is about, what's the example I used yesterday? Oh yeah, attacking 5G cell towers, right? Because they give you cancer or whatever it is. So you're in this one setting, and the moral context has changed from 1 second to the next, the time that it took you to get to the next post. In the real world before, you'd have to go to 2 separate places most of the time to be exposed to that sort of stuff. So you're gonna get mainstreaming and moral diffusion, where, you know, it's gonna reach people it wasn't reaching before. And you're gonna get this hybrid mix because there's not the physical barriers between. So it used to be that, you know, people who thought a certain way tended to live in very homogeneous settings. This is not the case anymore. And this is a concern because what we come to see as moral or legitimate is what we come to see as possible to do and advantageous for us to do. That's why we develop morality as a species in the first place. Morality helps you to decide what's advantageous for you to do. And if this spreads, then we might be looking at a problem, and we might be looking at the goalpost moving, which I think is a feature of this problem, not a bug, in the sense that, yes, we've been worrying mostly about terrorism, then radicalization and violence, and we're going to be forced to worry about extremism per se, I think, whether we like it or not. And in terms of whether that's a game changer or not, there's 2 responses to that. No, because I think the susceptibility profile, like the canariness, that's going to stay the same. It doesn't matter. That stays the same across forms of extremism. What will change is the transsectional vulnerability, if I'm right about this, is that it will change because it doesn't have to be about, you know, running people over and stabbing them. It can be about other forms of harm, of which, you know, I don't know, refusing to pay your taxes or refusing to get vaccinated might be one. And so I think whether we like it or not, we're going to have to worry about this. And as has been mentioned before, I'm getting to the end, our already disorganized ecologies might get even more disorganized by the fact that we have the introduction of all sorts of technologies that we don't understand, that very few people know how they work, like, you know, algorithms at Facebook and stuff like this. How do you want to govern this when you don't understand how it works? We saw in 2008 during the financial crisis, when you have financial technologies that no one knows how they work, the system collapses and no one knows even what happened. And so here there's the risk that it's going to be the same. I'm especially curious about the introduction of digital touch, because attachment is a lot about touching other people. You know, the people you're attached to are the ones you hug, and now there's going to be a way to convey touch over virtual settings. Is that going to change something? I have no idea, but that's a question I ask myself. And to finish, so what that means for interventions, it means, I think, that the interventions need to be as fragmented as the ecology is. So what I say is that, you know, you can't counter prison radicalization, but you can counter radicalization in a prison, or even better, in a part of the prison. You can't counter online extremism, but you can disrupt an extremist setting online. And so having local, ultra local, the smaller the better, right? Down to the street level if you can. Local partnerships is going to be the key going forward. So I would say go small and go easy, in the sense that, remember, for a lot of the time you're working with canaries and things like, critical thinking training and stuff like this, you're asking people to have a hard time thinking to think harder. So think about the unintended consequences of some of those interventions. And finally, collect data. No one collects data about place, right? And of all the levels of, explanations I've talked about, 4 out of the 5 are about place. Only 1 is about people. So collect data about where, both online and offline. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Bouhana. I told you it would be a tour de force. You've given us so much to digest, and we do have, and I'm sure we're going to be really reflecting on this throughout our 3 days. And I'd invite you to, as we listen to a lot of the other presentations, try to see what this framework will bring to your understanding of the many other sessions and presentations that we're having today. So we have about 10, 15 minutes before we break for questions for Professor Bouhana. We have our volunteers roving with microphones. So if you could just raise your hand, just very quickly, just because we don't have too much time, ask your question, and I can call on you. I see one over there and one here. So please, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor. This was fascinating. I just would like to ask you if you could perhaps use your ecological theory framework to help us to understand the most recent race riots in England. Because it seems that so far, most of the analysis was, as you were pointing out, looking at individual risk factors. But the logical question of why were these things happening at the certain places in terms of the attacks on the minorities because they're not white on the street? Like, why was it happening in certain places? Was it about the local level of deprivation? Was it about, sudden arrival of a number of people who look different? What is about those places that you could help us to understand? Thank you.
All right. So I don't really like talking about stuff I don't know anything about. So all I know about the UK riots is the same stuff that I've seen, that you've all seen on TV. I mean that in the sense that I haven't had access to any police data or any privileged information about, who was involved. And frankly, before, in the same way that you get intelligence about the people from the place, you get intelligence about the place from the people. So having some kind of profile, of the ages, the genders, the occupations. I would be particularly interested in finding out if these were people with already criminal history who were mostly involved. I've talked some because we're thinking about an EU project next year looking at gender and fluid extremism and how those things might relate. So I talked some to a researcher in Ireland who had access to police data, unlike me. And what was interesting was, and I guess it goes with a hybrid mixed theme, is that a lot of the people involved seem to have been, so I'm very cautious with what I say, this is not an affirmation, but to have had links with nationalist movements, right? So, but already even, violent extremist nationalist movements. And so whether it was a fragmentation of the movement, whether it was directed by the movement, whether it was those people, because those were the people who had the experience of violence and knew how to, set up a riot, I could not tell you. So I cannot answer your question before that. But I think you could get good intelligence if you have the profile of the people who are involved.
Hi. Tamkin from Home Affairs, Department of Home Affairs from Western Australia. I'm just wanting to answer just a very specific question. I know you mentioned around the setting avoidances or the chasm.
Affordances.
Affordance, sorry.
Yeah.
The 4 key areas, and you said they all need to be working at the same time to essentially to really work. You can't really focus on one area at different times. But you said over a period of time. What is, I guess, that time period? I know it's case by case sometimes, but what do you find is the best, I guess, practice in terms of duration?
So do you remember my double pyramids, like one going, and I said, depending on how long you are on the continuum of canariness. So when I say susceptibility, it means susceptibility to changing your mind about moral norms. So basically what's right and wrong. You have that susceptibility, which is linked to the characteristics that I linked at the start. People who have those characteristics, theoretically, I don't think this has actually been tested in the lab or anything, will not need to spend as much time. So one of the cases that I mentioned the police officers with the prison research, and one of the cases they interviewed, and I interviewed the mom as well, was the archetype of the canary. The guy had tried probably 5 or 6 religions before he even got to Islam. Then, got arrested for building his own suicide vest, then sent to prison, and very young. In prison, met some tact offenders, hated them on the spot, de-radicalized in 5 minutes, switched religion 2 more times, right? And now he's a Buddhist. So a person like that, it's gonna take to see any. Now, I couldn't tell you, is it like a fundamental change? I don't know how to measure that. But behaviorally, at least there was a change of great significance. And he's now has been working. I mean, I don't know about recently because I haven't followed the case in the last few years, but actually has been helping de-radicalize other people almost from the get-go. When he found himself in a new environment, in this case, the prison, the switch was almost, I don't want to say overnight, but very, very quick, right? So I would say, depending on the susceptibility level, if you have someone who's not susceptible at all, it's going to take a while. Right. But, if you think about military training is one giant chasm setting. OK, you take people who you assume have no proclivity for violence. Right. And you go through a very structured, ongoing process to get them to the point where, at least under circumstances, they think it's morally legitimate to do it. Right. But you start with people who aren't particularly susceptible to that, who don't really, some always will. I always have a couple of psychopaths also who join the army. But mostly, especially in places where you have regular citizens joining the military, imagine this, it takes a while. But if you have someone who's very susceptible to basically changing their minds, it might not take that long. It's all about interaction.
I think that's 5 minutes right there.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm Winifred Lewis from the University of Queensland. We've just started to collect data with place. I'm a social psychologist. We're having trouble theorizing and understanding it. It's connected with what you just said. A place could be a nexus of age and gender and profession. I mean, is there something special? What is the special and important character of physical place? And how can we understand, part 2 of my question, the sort of migrations that we have within a city? Like, we're starting to look at how you start at home, you go to work on Collins Street, you go to a conference in Melbourne, then you come back. Those kinds of migrations are characteristic of many professions and social relationships.
Yeah.
Does that migration create more vulnerability or more stability because you're exposed to diverse chasm settings?
So here I'm going to introduce the concept of the activity field. So what you call migration is what criminologists call routine activities, right? So in the time that you go through your routine activities, and there's a huge literature on that. If you haven't looked at it, please look at it, right? And they use that to reason about victimology, crime risk. And so as you go through your activity, you create your daily activity field. Yes, sometimes you go on holiday in the Fiji, but most of the time, you're always in the same part of town doing your thing all the time. Well, mostly creatures of habit. Imagine this create like a sort of perimeter. You are vulnerable, especially, obviously, to radicalizing settings that exist within this perimeter. Especially if you have those background characteristics that link you to that place. If it's football grounds and you happen to be a football fan, obviously there's more chance you're going to find your way there but obviously those settings move in time. And that's why, you don't have the stable profiles because, at one point they might decide to recruit or reach out to people, spot people in the football grounds, but then, they get spotted or there's something changes or their team loses too many times and they don't want to go to the football game anymore. And then it moves to basketball. And so, we used to look at the backgrounds and think, oh, this indicator indicates susceptibility. Being a football fan is a marker of susceptibility to radicalization. No, it's a marker of selection to exposure to radicalizing. It's not the same thing because in terms of intervention, it's not the same thing you're trying to disrupt. Does that answer your question?
Yes. If I were be allowed to ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So do you ever use predictive statistics? And if so, how do you model that?
Oh, well, because
Sorry, just to repeat my question, because I've been given the mic. Do you ever use predictive statistics? And if so, how do you model that particular emergent and fluid marker?
No. No, because the data isn't there. And I did indeed not talk about data collection, but I'm more, I used to be very, and that's a shift, internal shift. I used to be very much, oh, we should only care about behavioral markers and mostly only worry about action and stuff like this. But I've changed my mind about that, and that has led me to consider different sorts of approaches like digital ethnography, which is not at all my background. But there's stuff I want to understand about the way people on the internet move around those platforms that I cannot capture, or at least I don't know how, and I cannot capture it. Or, as I said, the sort of things that I can only get out with the focus groups is that I can see what they're doing on the internet, but what are they doing at the same time off the internet? Because I want to understand the whole habitat. And the whole habitat is augmented. It's not either offline or online. And I think there are key dynamics in those two. So when introducing interventions or delivering anything, it needs to be in a whole habitat. You need to take the whole habitat into account, right?
Thanks, Jen. Just last question.
Thank you. So thanks, Noemie. This is now
The second time.
I've heard this, and it's as fascinating the second time as it has been the first. But look, I want to ask what maybe a slightly provocative question.
Am I wrong about something?
No, it's not a question of wrong, but it may be a question about whether something is missing. So, in your susceptibility exposure model, when I think about the place analysis, you go right back to somebody like Peter Neumann, right? 2008 mosques, as places. So we've seen this before, but the fact remains that no matter which places we look at over time in relation to terrorist and violent extremist trajectories, hotbeds or not, only a small fraction of people in those places actually get to the point that we're all worried about. Okay. A really small fraction. What explanatory model do we need that helps us understand between susceptibility on the one hand, exposure on the other, what is happening in the middle for all those people who don't get to where we're worried they're going to get to?
Well, I mean, that's why you need to consider the whole habitat. Right, because they spend time in that. I remember also the era of the mosques where we're all worried about the mosques, and it was easier to analyze because at least you could identify compared to online stuff.
Easier, but also problematic.
Well, obviously problematic. But my point is that if you think about activity fields, what place does the mosque play in their activity field? We think about protective factors, right? We've started to move away from risk and realize that it's a balance. You can have a lot of risk factors, but if you have a lot of protective factors, then you may be completely fine. But this is the same. You need to look at the whole ecology. So, okay, they spend time in that mosque. Maybe they spend a lot of time in that mosque, but where do they spend time the rest of the time, right? And probably it's in settings that balance out. It's pro-social chasm settings, or their level of susceptibility is really low. And they can spend ages in that place. Also, because when I say you have to go small, I mean you have to go really small. If you read those reports by Newman and colleagues or other people at ICSR and King's, they say things like, they do the interviews and they say things like, you know, a conversation was going on at the back of the room. It's not the whole place. It's like my prison, you know, it's the back of that one room. That's where the problem was. And possibly not everyone was allowed to go to the back of that one room. You know, possibly other people didn't even notice what was going on or had reason not to notice. It's, once you start thinking about place, it gets really fine-grained. And it's really a case of you can use yourself as your own unit of analysis and realize how susceptible or not susceptible you are to the material you get exposed to every day, and how much you engage or do not engage with the place that you spend time in. Does that answer somewhat? Yeah.
Well, everyone, can we just thank Professor Bouhana one more time? Thank you so much for that amazing keynote. I think it really set the tone for our 3 days, given us a lot to think about, as I said. And while you're thinking, I welcome you to go now to morning tea. You've earned a good break. I will be back here in half an hour's time. We'll start to kind of herd you all into the 2 sessions. There's going to be, the room will now be split into session A and session B, and you can see in your program what's on offer and where you'd like to go. So enjoy morning tea. See you shortly.